copies of it. So as we go through our talk tonight, just kind of use that as a reference, and I'll point it out some too as we go. Also, if you look at this, I use BC and AD, and as I was going through, I was surprised and to see some dates that I wasn't familiar with. Has anybody ever seen a date when it says BCE or CE? And do you know what that reference? I didn't either, so I was like, well, what is that? So I looked it up. So everybody knows BC is before Christ, right? And AD is after his death, Anno Domini, which is in the year of the Lord, which means, the year that he passed. But BCE stands for before common era, and CE is common era. And I didn't know this. It says it's been utilized since the 1700s. But if you think the reason it's like that, it takes Christianity out of the whole equation. But what's funny about it was, when you look at it, the whole pivot of when BCE and CE starts and ends is the death of Christ. So they didn't take it out, but they didn't want to use it in actual verbiage. So, for those that choose not to use BC and AD, that's why BCE and CE is there, which I found very interesting. All right. So to begin with, if you look at your timeline, and some of these, most of these dates, there's no definitive date here. It's kind of a, what scholars have put together to say this is a best guess based off of writings that we have, events that have been documented and stuff. So when you look at these dates, some of them I've got, a couple of years there showing. Some of them are a specific year, but they're all with, they can fluctuate a few years. So don't get hung up on that as much. But I do want to point that out. And as I was looking at this, I wanted to say, okay, well, we know the Apostle Paul, and we read about a lot of what he did, but how did he line up with Jesus? And if you look at that number 1 where it says 6 to 4 BC, that was kind of when the birth of Jesus is estimated, either 6 to 2 BC. I read some that said 2 BC, but between 6 and 4 BC is what I've got down here. And then you see 5 AD is when Paul was born in Tarsus. So what does that mean? Well, that means that Paul, and it's at 5 AD again, it can fluctuate a few years, but if we use these dates, Paul was about, Jesus was about 9 years old when Paul was born. And I found that interesting. So now we know that, Jesus and Paul were pretty close in age. And another thing here, we'll talk about this, is some of the distances that Paul traveled in his life, but I thought that was very interesting. So we know Saul was born around 5 AD in the city of Tarsus, which was in the region of Cilicia. So this was part of the Roman Empire. So the Romans had invaded this area several years before Paul was born. So today this area, if you look on a map, it's in modern-day Turkey. So if you looked at a modern-day map, if you found Turkey, you know that this is where Tarsus was located. And it says Tarsus was a very large center of trade, very close to the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And it was a very influential city in Asia Minor at the time because of the trade that took place in that area. So if you looked at a map and said, okay, well, here's where Tarsus is, where is it in relationship to Jerusalem? Driving distance is 435 miles. So if you were traveling on foot or by donkey or, back in time that Paul was there, just think, 500 miles. But how long would it take you to travel 500 miles? But Jerusalem, it plays a very important part in Paul's life, and as we go through this, you'll see. But I just wanted to tell you, it's nearly, 430 to 500 miles, depending on how they traveled, and you can imagine the roads and the hills and probably footpaths and everything. So it was a probably strenuous journey to make it from where Paul was born down to Jerusalem. So Paul was born of a devout Jewish family. So now you've got, Paul was born in Tarsus in a Roman Empire, yet he was a Jew. And we all know what the Romans thought of the Jews, right? So kind of like, and remember, as we get down in here, Paul says, I'm a Roman citizen. So why is Paul, being a Jew, considered a Roman citizen? Well, at the time, his family owned land in Tarsus. And the law for the Roman Empire was if you were a landowner in an area that was, run by the Romans, then you were considered a citizen of the Roman Empire. So his family they weren't just the wealthiest, but they were also not peasants either. They did own land. And as we talk through, you'll see that they had money, but they weren't like, rulers or anything like that. But they actually were considered Roman citizens because of the ability to own land. What trade did Paul learn from his father? Does anybody know? He was a tent maker. And even though his father was also a Pharisee, which, it's in the text that Paul's father was a Pharisee. By trade, he was a tent maker. And Paul studied under his father tent making up until he was 14 years old. And that is a key time in his life. Let's see. So at the age of 14, Saul now is going to be sent to Jerusalem. So remember, we said 435 driving miles. He's sent at age 14 all the way to Jerusalem to study the Jewish law under Gamaliel. And you mentioned this, I think, in some of our studies, Gary, about Gamaliel. And he was a very renowned a teacher of the Jewish law. So you have Paul that comes from a Jewish family in a Roman Empire area, but they have enough money that they can send him down to Jerusalem at the age of 14 to study under this Gamaliel, who's a very renowned teacher of the Jewish law. And you can read this. Let's turn to Acts 22:3. I can get there myself. So in Acts 22:3, it says, Then he said, I am indeed a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, meaning Jerusalem, at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and was zealous toward God, as you all are today. So this is confirmation that, Paul was a student under Gamaliel. So after Paul completes his studies, and if you'll look if you'll look to the left, we're at 19 AD is when he goes to study at the school of Gamaliel in Jerusalem. And then in 27 AD, Paul returns to Tarsus to serve in the local synagogue. So he's in Jerusalem for 8 years studying, and I couldn't verify that those 8 years were complete study, or if he finished his studies and was doing some type of other teaching while he was there. You would think that after 8 years, went there at the age of 14. He's about 22 now. He's been studying. Probably is more like a assistant or something, but that's just conjecture on my part. But he is at this point sent back to Tarsus. So once he's been there for 8 years, they say, okay, it's time for you to go back to Tarsus. He goes back there, and now in Tarsus, he is serving in the local synagogue as a teacher of the Jewish laws and stuff. So at the age of 22, he's back in Tarsus. So he's there in Tarsus, and then if you look just below that, around 30 A.D. is when we believe Jesus was crucified. So he's in Jerusalem in 27 A.D., goes back to Tarsus. So he's in that area about the time Jesus probably started his ministry. So you wonder, kind of wonder, even though there's nothing in our scripture that points out that he ever saw Jesus or he heard Jesus or anything like that, but he's in the area. And then the next line says he returned to Jerusalem in 30 to 31 A.D. So again, very close to the time period. Did he come back to Jerusalem after Jesus was crucified? We don't know that for sure, but it could have been in 31. But it's very interesting to me to know this is how close Paul was, to physically seeing Jesus, maybe hearing things about Jesus, that he's preaching over here or whatever. I just found that very interesting. So at the age of 25, then the reason he comes back to Jerusalem, he's 22 when he goes to Tarsus, he's 25 when he comes back, he's going to be a member of the Sanhedrin. So this is a pretty big deal too, to be a member of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the high council for all of Jewish law. So they set all the Jewish laws for all Jewish people throughout the area. In the Sanhedrin, you had a chief priest, you had a vice chief justice, and then you had 69 general members or judges. And of those 69, you had Sadducees and you had Pharisees. And the difference there, Sadducees they pretty much catered to the wealthy. So and then you had the Pharisees that were the middle class, and they were a little bit more liberal in their thought processes as far as the Jewish laws go. So I found that interesting too, to say, well, Paul was a Pharisee. He had a little bit more liberal thoughts, but they weren't liberal enough to accept Jesus, right? It was still, we're not going to be putting up with this guy. But I found that very interesting that, so there in 30 and 31, he's back. He's now sitting in the Sanhedrin, which is a pretty, prominent position to have. And then you see in 32 A.D., the stoning of Stephen. And so this is where, in the Bible, this is when we first are introduced to Paul, or first hear of Paul. So if you turn with me to Acts 7:57. Acts 7:57. Somebody like to read that for me?
Then they cried out with a loud voice and stopped their ears and ran upon him with one accord.
Oh, I'm sorry, and keep reading there a little bit further. I'm sorry.
And cast him out of the city and stoned him in
Okay, so there we have Saul, the Apostle Paul, mentioned for the first time. And he's mentioned as a young man. So what does that mean? We know now we're sitting here on our timeline at 32 AD. He was born in 5 AD, so it puts him about 27 years old. So why did they mention they set their cloaks down at the feet of a young man? Are we looking at a different Saul? No, we're not. The reason in that day and time it was customary to mention or to call someone a young man up to the age of 40. So you could be a young man up to the age of 40, or referred to a young man up to the age of 40 in this period, in this time. So, yeah. But you're way past young man, okay? But so when I've read that before, in my mind, you hear young man, I'm thinking maybe, 15, 16 years of age, or maybe even younger. But we know, based off of facts that scholars have done, that Paul was at least 20-something years old at the time of Stephen's stoning. So, but that's the first mention of Saul or Paul in our Bible. So then, if you looked further on at our little timeline here, in 34 AD, approximately 2 years after the stoning of Stephen, this is when Saul, or Paul the Apostle, travels to Damascus. Can anybody remember why he's traveling to Damascus? He's persecuting Christians. He asked for letters so he could go to Damascus, and if he were to find any Christians there, he could put them in stocks or whatever and bring them back to Jerusalem and have them jailed and possibly killed. So, he's 29-ish years old when he does this. So he's journeying to Damascus, and that's why he's going. And what happens on the road to Damascus? He hears the voice of blinding light, and he hears the voice of Jesus speaking to him. And so we know in the book of Acts, chapter 9, that's where this all takes place, is where he's traveling and he sees the light and he hears Jesus' voice. But he's not converted right then, right? Well, he might have had an idea, but he's really not converted. He goes on into Damascus because he's not there yet. He's blinded. He hears the voice of Jesus. It tells him to go into Damascus, and you'll meet somebody there. Who's he going to meet? Ananias. So now Ananias is there in Damascus, and he's told that he's to do something. And if you look at Acts 9, verse 18, this is where let's read 17 and 18. And Ananias went his way and entered the house, and laying his hands on him, he said, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you came, has sent me that you may receive your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Immediately there fell from his eyes something like scales, and he received his sight at once, and he arose and was baptized. So that's when I believe you can say Saul or Paul was converted at that point, when he was given his sight and he was baptized by Ananias. So again, we're looking at around 34 AD, so we're 29 years old. This is 4 years after the death of Jesus. Jesus, we think, was around the age of 33 when he was crucified. Paul's 34 when he was converted. I think it's very, interesting. Now we have Paul that's become a Christian now, and he's almost at the same age, or very close to the age that we believe Jesus was when he was crucified. So he spends some time in Damascus, in that area, but in 39 AD, and there's nothing in the Bible here to back this up. This was just from my research and stuff. In 39 AD, he travels back to Jerusalem. So Damascus is north of Jerusalem. I don't know the exact mileage, but it's between Jerusalem and Tarsus. It's about maybe halfway. So we're looking at, 175 miles or so. But he comes back into Jerusalem in 39 AD. And then in, in 39 to 43 AD, he preaches in the area of Syria and Cilicia. So now Cilicia, remember, Tarsus was in Cilicia. So he's back up in that area now, and he spends approximately 4 years up in that area preaching. Then in 44 AD, Barnabas takes Paul to Antioch. In 45 AD, he's back in Jerusalem. But then in 45 through 49 AD, we see that he takes his first missionary journey. And when I looked up the travels of Paul and said, through the first, second, and third missionary journeys, how many miles did Paul travel? Any venture of a guess there? Over those 3 missionary journeys, how many miles did Paul? We estimate that he traveled. And this is both on land and on sea as well, because he did take some ships and stuff. But he traveled 10,000 miles, approximately. 10,000 miles on 3 missionary journeys. That's 4 times if you went from New York City to Los Angeles, 4 times. That's a lot of traveling. And and it's talked about in the Bible about the difficulties that Paul had on these journeys. And it wasn't just the difficulties of dealing with the persecution. I mean, this is rough traveling, shipwrecked, walking footpaths up and down. That area is mountainous. It's not, flat. It's like walking through the Smoky Mountains, I guess, just, up and down traveling. So 10,000 miles in those 3 journeys. And those 3 journeys, if you wanted to look at them, the first missionary journey is covered from Acts 13:4 through 15:35. Those describe those missionary journeys. And then the second missionary journey is from Acts 15:36 through Acts 18:22. And then the third missionary journey is Acts 18:23 through Acts 21:17. Now, I know Brother Gary has talked about this. There could have been, or some people say it could have been a fourth missionary journey. And which one would that have been? That his last time to Rome when he became a prisoner, right? So there is another journey there, and that one's covered from Acts 21, 1 through 28:16. So again, the time period from the start of the missionary journeys until the time that they ended was from AD 46 to AD 57. So for about 11 years, Paul did these missionary journeys. And if you look at your timeline to the left, there's some things that he did in between. So he did his first missionary journey for about 4 years, back to Jerusalem. Stayed there a year, left, did his second missionary journey for about 3 years, AD 51 through 54. Back to Jerusalem again, same year in 54. Huh? Say again?
Why would he always go back to Jerusalem? I mean, that's where he did his
Mm-hmm. I find that interesting too. There's nothing there that says, specifically why he traveled back to Jerusalem, but I, you know, that's where, to me, I guess
That's the hub.
the church started.
The whole hub of Christianity.
Yeah, the church started there, so I think he was going back. He knew that he could get back there. He'd be around people that, he was familiar with. I guess he'd reset, maybe figure out what my next, step is, and then go on his way. So
The majority of the Christians, the people that had been converted at that point in time, were in Jerusalem.
we're in that.
That was the biggest area for the Christian race.
Gotcha.
Most of the apostles based out of Jerusalem.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just about, and that was the main hub for the church, Jerusalem.
So we see again in 54 AD, he went back to Jerusalem and then left again in 54 through 58 on his third missionary journey. Where did he go? Came back to Jerusalem again at the end of, or sometime in 58. And then for 2 years, he kind of took a hiatus there in Caesarea. I say hiatus. There's not a lot said about what he did while he was gone for those 2, or in those 2 years. But then,
His age, Bob. Look at his age at that point.
yeah, he's 55 years old, about 55, 54, 55. So, I mean, he's traveled 10,000 miles in 11 years, and it's not like he got into a luxury four-wheel drive, air-conditioned, Chevrolet cross country or whatever they call those trucks. And yeah, so, he's done and Paul talked about he was afflicted too. So we don't know if there was some kind of other physical ailment that we think there was, but we don't know exactly what it was. But we think there was some kind of physical ailment there that was probably hindering him as well. So maybe those 2 years was a time to just recover. So in 60 to 61 AD, he travels to Rome. And again, I show that as the fourth missionary journey, if you want to call that a missionary journey. But he was imprisoned in 61 through 64 in Caesarea and under house arrest in Rome for those 3 years. It was in between, and I didn't have it broken up as how much time he was in prison and how much time he was in house arrest. But and then for 3 years again, he kind of does conjectural travels, and I should have done a better job of looking up what the conjectural travels are. Maybe you can help me here, Gary. But he, again, it's not. He didn't have a definitive agenda, so to speak. This was more or less just, from my understanding, just traveling around and not so much preaching as much as and trying to establish new churches, I guess is the best way to put it.
I think too that during that period of time, probably he, all those people he'd been in contact with, and all the people that was with him and around him and all, he probably spent the time revisiting some of those people that he had been with for those.
And that's what I think it was. It was more or less, again, not so much trying to establish new churches. You can see, as we point out, Paul's now past 60 years of age. It's probably his body is breaking down. Even though he was very zealous as far as wanting to try to convert people, I just don't know if he had as much energy as he did in the previous years. And then finally in 68 AD, you see that it was the third Roman imprisonment and his execution. And we know how Paul was executed.
Cut his head off.
He was beheaded. So the other thing that I have here in my notes is, if we look back, how many books of the New Testament did Paul write that we know specifically or are pretty close? 13. And what's the one that is in question? Hebrews. So, some scholars say yes, some say no, but we're pretty sure 13 of the books were written by Paul. We had 4 prison epistles. I'm not going to ask you. Do we know what those prison epistles were, the 4 prison epistles? Right. And then he had 3 pastoral epistles. These where he wrote a letter to a specific pastor. So you take a hint, it's the name of a person.
You got a first and second, remember that.
1st and 2nd Timothy, and then Titus. So, you know, I hope that by doing the timeline here, it helps paint a picture of Paul's life in the sense of how close he was to when Jesus was on this earth and doing his ministry. And, you know, Paul, when he's in when he's in Jerusalem and he's stoning, he participates in the stoning of Stephen. You know, we're talking just a couple of years after Jesus was crucified. So when he came back into Jerusalem around that 30 to 31 AD, he's hearing all of this, you know, speak about Jesus and the conversion. So this is when his blood is really boiling because he is a devout Pharisee. He can't stand to hear somebody talk about the Messiah because in no way did they believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and just, you know, was pretty much blaspheming the Jewish traditions and the Jewish ideals. So he is just burning hot about trying to make sure that he does all he can to quell this, but just in 4 years after the death of Jesus, he's converted. And so for 29, he's 29. We think he passed at the age of about 63. So for more than half his life, he was dedicated to Christ and did his work. So again, just for me, I enjoyed looking these things up and studying and being able to put these dates together and get that idea of how close Paul was to, again, we don't have anything that says he ever saw Jesus, but he sure was close to being in Jerusalem about the time Jesus was there and in that area. So, you know, he may have, and can you imagine what his thoughts would have been if he had seen Jesus at that time? He would have been burning hot, wouldn't he? I know it's a little early. Yes, sir.
Well, he didn't have to see him on the road to Damascus. Jesus spoke to him.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's just as good.
Well, I was just talking about before he became converted. You know, if he ran into him while Jesus was doing any of his preaching or any of the apostles or anything like that.
Do we know how many years he spent in prison all total?
4 years.
2 years in the Roman, and when he had about 2 years with Felix and Agrippa.
It's been a total of about 4 years.
I know he was in the Caesarea jail and then the Roman jail. So, yeah, it's not, I didn't look that up, but I'll take Gary's word for it.
I tell you what, I'm gonna give you an A+, but one of the things that's really intriguing to me, looking at what you've done and all your research, and I'm gonna give him an A+ for his lesson. But, you know, here's what's interesting to me. It's no wonder that he had so much to write about in the 13 book, possibly 14 book, but it's no wonder that he had so much that he could deal with because of all this right here that he's been involved in.
Mm-hmm.
And he had so much stuff to deal with because of the churches where he just continuously visited, you know. So looking at your timeline and everything, it's no wonder he had so many books that really fell into the New Testament.
Well, you know, and with the travels. You can imagine, or I don't guess we can imagine, but just think of 10,000 miles over 10 or 11 years, and the nights, the days when the weather was, probably pretty atrocious and you can't travel, or the nights that he was, alone. I say alone. He traveled a lot with people, a lot of times. But, I think Paul, being the scholar that he was, I mean, obviously, you went go to school for 8 years. Hey, you could be a lawyer today. You could be a veterinarian, be a doctor, right? If you go to school for
Not 8 years.
Okay.
Take 16.
Okay, so let's say a lawyer and a veterinarian. But yeah, he was a scholar. He knew how to study. He knew how to write. He knew how to really look into things and understand stuff to a very deep degree. Because from what we know about Gamaliel and the Jewish law, it was not an easy law, I don't think, to understand and to grasp. There were so many, I guess, intricacies, I would put it, to the Jewish law. So he was not an ignorant man, where a lot of the apostles prior to Paul were not learned men. And that's not to say that they were ignorant in the fact that but they weren't school taught, I guess, is so to speak. When the Holy Spirit comes on you, you can do anything. I would imagine that if the Lord wanted the apostles well, we know they spoke in tongues. They had never studied that before. So, but Paul was somebody that was learned. He knew he could write, he could read, and he knew how to study things. So. Oh, he was the one out of season. He was the one out of season that was named an apostle after the 12. You're right. God did. God appointed him as an apostle.
He was chosen out a few seasons by the Lord.
Bobby, would you mind giving the chapter and verse again of the missionary journey?
So.
I had the first one, but then I missed out on the second.
Okay. What I have is, so the second one was Acts 15:36 through 18:22. And then third one is Acts 18:23 through 21:17. Mm-hmm.
One thing, can you imagine what he must have, in his later years, what he must have thought when he looked back to the stoning of Stephen, when he was there involved in that? Can you imagine what he must have thought?
Oh, yeah. How it's like, and I read, we don't know exactly what his role was in the stoning of Stephen, other than knowing they laid his garments. Some of the things I read, and you got to be careful of what you read and who's publishing things out there. But being a member of the Sanhedrin, it kind of led to think that Paul was one of the guys that said, we need to go get this guy Stephen. And he was one of the guys that cast one of the first, or the guy that cast the first stone. Now, it's not written in the Bible that happened. I don't know how they determined that. It could have, maybe just human conjecture there. But, he was very adamant about persecuting Christians, and Stephen was an outspoken person. He wasn't and here's the thing: Stephen was not an apostle, but if you read about Stephen was very outspoken when it came to talking about Jesus and God and Christianity. So, and he had to have been, I guess, for these people to have taken him out and stoned him. But he was one not to shy away from. He wasn't afraid to say what he believed in, and so we don't know if Paul was the leader that took him out and stoned him. We just know that he was there, present at the time that they did stone him.
Had to weigh him. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
line, you know, later in life.
I was gonna say, do you think that during his travels after the conversion, he had time to think back over his life and how he went wrong?
You know, Paul was human. We're all human. Do you not think back on your life? So you got to think he did. And like Gary was saying, he was probably thinking, how in the world could I have ever stoned Stephen to death? How could I have persecuted? Who knows how many Christians he sent to jail and possibly sent to their death, even though he didn't physically he wasn't involved in it. They may have been put to death, after being imprisoned or crucified, because that was one of the things that they loved to do back then, especially the Romans. So,
I had a couple of things on the conjecture travels. In the last prison epistle, Philemon, one chapter in verse 22, he tells that he thinks he's going to be handed back over, from prison to Philemon. So that's about the time that he got out. So that may have been one of the things he did in his travel there.
okay, could have been.
Also, if you read what Stephen was preaching when he was stoned, if Paul was standing there, he had to know book, chapter, and verse. He was going down through the whole list of the prophets and what they were saying about Jesus and him coming.
Uh-huh.
So he had to know up to a point that the man knew what he was talking about.
But I'm sure all the Sadducees and the Pharisees knew when people started talking from the book, and you were talking about the Old Testament and the prophets and stuff, but they didn't want to hear it because they're like, no, well, this is not the Messiah that you're talking about. They weren't going to have that because that was going to take away from them. Yeah, their power was going to go away, and even today we know money drives a lot of things, even in some spiritual matters, I guess, so to speak. And that was their thing. That again, you didn't. It's lost on me about the where the person talks about, I don't stand on the street corner and throw ashes and beat myself because I want people to see me, right? Which is what a Sadducee or a Pharisee would do, because then people would say, oh, look, they wanted people to see that and stuff, and that's not what Christianity's about, so. Well, I appreciate your time, and thank you so much for the discussions, and I hope it was beneficial to you. I know it was beneficial to me to study this on my own, and like I said, if we can glean a little bit from it, we've done something. I appreciate it.